But acknowledging that is only the first step. The other is to start to understand what the failures of diplomacy, and I'm going to focus mostly on the American experience and the failures of American diplomacy, but how it animates, I think, a change in statecraft and the way we think about and execute it amongst all of our countries. In the recent past, we had the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Avoidable, I would assert. The October 7th Hamas attack at the behest of the Iranian regime. Another one, avoidable. And then, of course, the unbroken train of increasing provocations, military harassment that we've seen from the South China Sea all the way to the Bering Sea. That is not changing. China has not been deterred by our actions of cooperation or clear dialogue and diplomacy. Something has to change. And the failures go back, I would say, this new cycle of escalation to 2012, the Scarborough Shoal failures, and a wake-up call in D.C. that many policymakers embraced. But the consensus in Washington of a China consensus that we are in this new Cold War really did not occur until the Biden administration's failed attempts of re-engaging a cooperative type of arrangement with China, which failed, not because of America's choice, but because of Beijing's choice. So all of these failures in this changed geostrategic environment point to structural problems. And again, this is the American experience, but I think we can talk in the question session about how it might apply to other countries and our allies. Structural problems are inherent. Diplomacy, the way we conventionally have done it, military operations, the way we conventionally conceived them and executed them, and economic statecraft have not functioned appropriately in their independent, siloed off lines of effort. We have to have an integrated, I would not say integrated deterrence, but we have to have a new framework, and that requires structural changes, the way we do it. But the strategic framework, the one that I will discuss, and this goes back to work beginning in 2010, statecraft. The former Secretary of the Navy embraced this idea and changed the name to maritime statecraft. And it continues to live on with the current administration as well. And it is an acknowledgement that diplomacy, clear-eyed, realist diplomacy, has to be backed by sound and effective military presence to be effective. But it has to be targeted. And then it has to be blended with economic statecraft at the same time, so that allies and partners also see the benefits, or a beneficial risk calculation to aligning and siding with the U.S. and the West more generally. Where's the case study that this action has played out and can be effective? And it was by happenstance. And it's the West Kampala incident back in 2020 that actually is the most illustrative of this new naval statecraft and how it functions and how it can be successful. The reality is, this was not by design. And those that may not be familiar with the West Kampala, Malaysia had chartered context, Taiwan was having a presidential election. Those in the military understand that this is one of those situations. You can look at a calendar and know that you have to be ready and positioned for things to go perhaps in an escalatory ladder quickly. So China, of course, didn't like Malaysia in its waters. Malaysia, of course, had clear reasons to believe that it was in their EEZ. The cycle continued, naval presence from the U.S. had been sustained, but it was for Taiwan elections, being ready. It was not to contest what China was doing and agitating its neighbors in the South China Sea. But it looked differently in Beijing. Then there were statements for the first time. You had the commander of 7th Fleet, who actually connected naval presence with economic rights of our partners, in this case, Malaysia. It was a break from the past. But again, it wasn't planned. And you had, at the same time, increasing military presence with bombers flying from Guam. You had a statement from the Secretary of State that came in July that clearly articulated that China's plans were excessive and illegal. The sequence had been any different, it would have been an abject failure. But the response was pretty overwhelming. Southeast Asian nations started to push back on Beijing. They saw the U.S. as a reliable present partner, and most importantly, that it was not just military purposes the U.S. was in, but also their economic interests. It was the encapsulation of what it projected, hypothesized, and enabled statecraft into action. So what to do next? And again, with the limited time, I do want to also mention there's an economic benefit to pursuing such an effort. In the case of Djibouti, if you look in 2001, before the September 11th attacks, the economy was less than $500 million US in 2015 dollars. 8 years later, after a massive US presence and economic development that followed, their economy had grown by 7-fold. It's the genesis that military presence can engender economic development. A 2015 study puts further to this point that by having more agreements, more military presence shared between, the trust factor goes up, and that enables trade. Doubling that can actually have a 34% increase in trade. Cutting it in half, is the agreements as well as military presence, to include in-country, can actually have a deleterious effect for the U.S. in adjusted to today's dollars. By having that military trade, or military agreements as well as presence, it would cost $608 billion in U.S. GDP and lost trade opportunities. Again, that's the foundation of trust and understanding between countries. And it's a realistic and a realistic worldview. The final thing is the U.S. and all of us, we don't have infinite resources in military to address every issue in the world. Many will be very familiar with the new Undersecretary of Defense, Rich Colby. Very clearly articulated the priority is the Western Pacific because China is increasingly undertook. That is true, but we must also understand that acting in certain decisive theaters can shift the initiative to a situation where we are more likely to control and to deter bad actions from going us out of control. The first of those is the Eastern Mediterranean, the Northern Red Sea, and the Black Sea. Primarily Russia, but also China's in this new Silk Road. And then the number one, where there is the most to be lost and the most to be gained, is in the South China Sea. It's the key decisive theaters. But again, only by embracing the changed reality that we live in, changing our structures for a new Cold War that we are in, and taking on a naval statecraft construct, can we hope to deter the worst from occurring in this decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much. Today I will talk about 3 important roles that Japan is playing and is going to play as around it. First, defense of Taiwan. Second, slope protection. And third, defense industrial contribution. With an important policy change in 2022, Japan clarified its intention to make a full-fledged commitment to the defense of Taiwan and to build the capabilities necessary to achieve that goal. Japan will increase its defense budget by 60% over 5 years. Japan will strengthen its defense capabilities to deter China from attacking Taiwan. If war breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, Japan will provide bases to the US forces fighting for Taiwan and commit its Self-Defense Forces, or SDF, to defend Taiwan in conjunction with the US. Regarding the maritime security aspect of that commitment, there are 3 areas in which Japan has been making efforts. First, military operations to defend Taiwan. Against the backdrop of the rapidly growing military capabilities of China, Japan has announced a force improvement plan that emphasizes 7 areas. 1, standoff strike capabilities. 2, integrated air and missile defense capabilities. 3, unmanned assets for cross-domain operations. 5, command control and intelligence. 6, force mobility and civil defense. And finally, sustainability and resilience. The overall goal of Japan's force improvement plan is to enhance its war-fighting capabilities. In other words, while the previous defense force development plans focused on the acquisition of major equipment such as combat vehicles, naval vessels, and fighter aircraft, The current plan emphasizes how to maximize the utility of the major weapon systems in a war. If war breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, US and Japanese forces will operate closely together to defend Taiwan. At sea, Japanese forces will play important roles in ballistic and cruise missile defense, anti-submarine and anti-ship warfare, mine warfare, and land attack operations. However, given the intensive anti-access area denial efforts that China is undertaking, it will not be easy for US-Japan combined forces to operate within the force island chain. It is for that reason that in 2023, the US Department of State Defense initiated the Replicator Initiative to find ways to produce a large number of all-domain attritable autonomous systems to deter and deny China's operations inside the force island chain. The US is expected to field thousands of autonomous systems such as unmanned aerial, surface, and underwater vehicles. The replicator system will constitute part of inside force operating within China's A2AD area to deny and degrade China's access to key areas. The US Marine Corps has been exercising expeditionary advanced base operations for that purpose. More traditional forces such as carrier strike groups will constitute outside forces operating farther away to provide standard firepower. The US and Japanese militaries have already begun to study how to coordinate their forces based on those emerging operational concepts. Now let me turn to the second topic, slot protection. Since Chinese forces have been conducting exercises to blockade Taiwan and disrupt sea lines of communication or slots in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Western Pacific, slot protection will become one of Japan's most important goals. If China imposes a naval blockade on Taiwan and starts posing threats to slots in this region, transport ships and tankers bound for Japan will be forced to divert and pass through the Lombok Strait, Makassar Strait, Celebes Sea, and the Philippine Sea to enter ports in Japan. The voyage from a port in Saudi Arabia to a port on Pacific coast of Japan is about 7,000 nautical miles via the Strait of Malacca, but it would extend to about 8,000 nautical miles via the Lombok Strait. The question is how to secure those divert slots in a gray zone or wartime environment. Indeed, US and Japanese forces will do their best to prevent Chinese ships and submarines from sailing across the force island chain. The US and Japanese forces would have to deal with relatively few but potentially dangerous Chinese ships and submarines in choke points in the port in the Philippine Sea. For that purpose, the US Army has developed the ring of fire concept of deploying anti-ship missiles near the Malacca, Lombok, and Sunda Strait areas. Although the intensity of slot defense operations out in the Western Pacific would be lower than combat operations across the Taiwan Strait, it would not be easy for US and Japanese forces to conduct effective slot defense operations because a significant part of those forces will be engaged in combat operations across the Taiwan Strait. Finally, defense industrial contribution. The US and Japan agreed to establish a consultative mechanism on defense industrial cooperation acquisition and sustainment, or DICAS, D-I-C-A-S, in 2022. DICAS serves as the framework within which the two countries promote cooperation within their two defense industries, accelerate joint development and production of arms, and coordinate efforts for the NATO maintenance, repair, and overhaul, or MRO, of defense equipment. In the naval area, U.S. naval vessels operated in Japan started to receive MRO services in Japanese shipyards in 2019. However, the Japanese workers in those shipyards are military personnel employed by the U.S. military rather than employees of Japanese shipbuilders. At DICAS, the possibility of allowing Japanese workers employed by Japanese entities to provide MRO services to U.S. naval vessels is discussed. The U.S. also expects Japan to play a larger role in defense industrial cooperation, including shipbuilding. U.S. policymakers estimate that to rehabilitate the shipbuilding industry in the U.S., they will have to train 150,000 additional skilled workers over 10 years. Japan might be able to assist the U.S. in training skilled workers. U.S. Secretary of the Navy, John Phelan, who recently visited South Korea and Japan, expressed his hope that the Japanese companies would consider building ships in the U.S. and that the U.S. and Japanese shipbuilders develop and construct ships useful for commercial, both commercial and military purposes. Japanese shipbuilders likely to engage in those activities include Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Japan Marine United, and Kawasaki Heavy Industries. There are some challenges. First, if Japanese shipyards are used to build ships for the U.S. and provide MRO services to U.S. ships, they might not be able to fulfill the requirements for the Japanese maritime self-defense force. Additionally, both Japan and the U.S. must change their regulations on naval shipbuilding and MRO to make closer U.S.-Japan industrial cooperation possible. Second, the U.S. and Japanese shipbuilding industries might have become too small and inefficient for investment to be a viable option. Ships built in Japan are not necessarily regarded highly by Japanese operators. Furthermore, even if the shipbuilding industry in the U.S. comes back, there might not be a sufficient number of engineers who could work for it, given the significantly smaller number of American students studying science and engineering compared to those in China and Russia. Finally, the future of U.S. industrial policy remains unpredictable. Under such circumstances, it might not be easy for Japanese shipbuilders to make a substantial investment and commitment to overtures coming from the U.S. government at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a presentation to offer. Let me first place on record my gratitude to the Rock Navy and its formidable chief, and extend to all of you the greetings of all Indians. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about maritime uncertainty at the strategic level. What we're seeing right now is that two broad systems are currently engaged in global competition. One is a system that draws its legitimacy from consensually derived rules-based order, and the other is a state system that seeks to disrupt this consensually derived rules-based order and supplement it with an international order, but one which is whose rules are formulated and generated solely in Beijing. And reflecting a desire, therefore, to return to the Middle Kingdom period of Chinese hegemony, China is pushing for a global system of unipolarity that would be governed by rules formulated in Beijing, and something that would then situate China as the keystone of all aspects of intra and extra-regional affairs. On the other hand, in contrast, the US has at least thus far created a system that sought to coordinate its own actions with those of major like-minded Indo-Pacific middle powers, contending that this was necessary to balance and counter China's belligerent actions. But now, from the Indian perspective, there are new doubts. And these doubts revolve around whether President Trump's vision of the world is not really one of great power competition, but actually of great power collusion. A system which is quite similar to the concert of Europe that prevailed in the 19th century. And so we worry about whether President Trump simply wants a world which is managed by strong men who work together, not always harmoniously, but always purposefully, to impose a shared vision of order on the rest of the world. Which one is true? It's very difficult from New Delhi's perspective to make out. Lots of comments have been made about Russia. I thought I'd touch upon it. India shares an active border with China, and it is a hot border. And India cannot afford the worst nightmare that Europe, USA, and India share, which is the formulation of a military axis between Russia, China, North Korea, and perhaps one other country. Many of you think it's Iran, I think it's Turkey. So India's membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS often causes a great deal of angst, particularly in Europe. And people ask us why we are there, and I want to ask you in return that what is the worst nightmare? This: Europe is not talking to Russia. Europe is talking at Russia. Russia is not talking to Europe. Russia is talking at Europe. And the same applies to the United States. So the only adult in that room is, I'm afraid, India. India is the only one which is talking to Russia. Now, is Russia going to talk to India? This depends on how much heft, how much dying heft India is able to generate, and therefore it is in everybody's interest to actually ensure that this adult in the room does function as the adult. And we do not end up in an undue embrace of China and Russia. How should we think about Turkey? Should we think about Turkey as the upholder of public international maritime law, or as the disruptor of the Indian Ocean? All this is causing geopolitical uncertainty right across the Indo-Pacific. And as far as India is concerned, we're quite clear that while the fundamental, remember, we are not a postmodern country. Our borders are contested. And the fundamental cartographic identity and the territorial integrity of India will always demand the exercise of land power and aerospace power. But the next 2 centuries are going to be centuries of the sea and of space. And in the course of these 200 years, India will either be a maritime power and a space power, or India will not be any kind of power at all. And so our challenge will always be how to achieve the right balance between our maritime and our land-based geopolitical imperatives in this era of geopolitical uncertainty. For India, our grand strategy, our military strategy, and our maritime strategy are all being increasingly contextualized to the Indo-Pacific. But for India, this is our outreach to the region, this is our time. And what is important is that for India, our maritime policy is now Mahasagar, which is an acronym standing for Mutual and Holistic Advancement of Security and Growth across regions. And for India, this is really important in this room, the Indo-Pacific is not in and of itself a strategy. The Indo-Pacific is a strategic geography. And in that strategic geography, New Delhi formulates and executes a number of strategies. In times of peace, we have 5 basic approaches to constructive engagement of the Indo-Pacific. We understand that strategic convergence with our partners is to be found in a number of policy fields, and therefore the number of these fields and the depth to which this convergence occurs is giving rise to a hierarchy of strategic partnerships which we think might well be an alternative to the US treaty alliances of the Cold War period. And so this is how the current Indian formulation of strategic partnership looks. Remember, the word strategic strategic is not military here, it is strategic in the true sense. So, the 5 constructs are multilateral constructs. India is at the heart of almost all the constructs within the western segment of the Indo-Pacific, which is called the Indian Ocean. And as a result, it is also at the heart of many of the constructs that lie in the eastern segment of the Indo-Pacific, which is the Pacific Ocean. Many of these, of course, are ASEAN-led. Every regional structure, ladies and gentlemen, must have at least 3 layers. It must have a conceptual layer, a political layer, and an executive layer, which will actually do the doing, which is what this room is filled with, naval practitioners, as I was myself. At the conceptual layer, we believe that the Mahasagar and its first order specificity given by the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative is indeed the conceptual layer. We could have 2 kinds of political layers. Either it could be the IORA, or it could be the East Asia Summit, which is leader-led. But in the executive layer, there is no doubt that we need to see an amalgam between the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium and the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. Our second approach is the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, and here we have a completely new construct with many countries stepping up and saying, hi, I have an idea, I'll take the lead. And so you can see from this slide that there is some progress, some considerable progress since its initial articulation. Our third approach is through minilaterals, such as BIMSTEC, and also the 7 trilaterals that India currently has between India, USA, Japan, India, Japan, Italy, India, Indonesia, Australia, India, Australia, France, India, France, UAE, and India, Brazil, and South Africa, apart from the 5 countries of the Colombo Security Conclave apart from India. Our fourth approach is the Quad. And the Quad, we think, is doing exactly what the Quad should be doing, which is trying to knit the Indo-Pacific region tightly enough so that countries like China do not have the approach or they do not find an avenue in which to insert themselves. And this involves everything from infrastructure to comprehensive maritime domain awareness, HADR partnerships, and the like. And our fifth and last approach is the proactive promotion of connectivity. Lots of people talk about maritime connectivity, and they're all flying at 38,000 feet. Nobody goes, the trick is not to fly the aeroplane at 38,000 feet. Anybody can fly a plane there. The trick is how to make the plane land without crash and burn. And therefore we have at least 6 elements of maritime connectivity that need to be addressed. Which ports do you want to connect? What medium do you want to connect them over? What platforms will move on that medium? What will be carried on those platforms? And then what policies will you generate for them? At the regional level, India's approach is governed by Zoltan Mehte's comment that money is a coward. Money does not go where there is turbulence and risk. And therefore, since we need the flow of money in all forms, trade, direct investments, etc., we are driven to support regional maritime stability. Now we have a number of security guideposts that govern our attention, and I wanted to be able to close by emphasizing that India's approach to the Indo-Pacific is dead in alignment with that of the Republic of Korea. It is dead in alignment with the approach of the United States itself. But at the geopolitical or the grand strategic level, there is uncertainty that we must wait for. Finally, in India, we are quite clear that a foreign policy, a military policy, cannot be predicated upon the 4 years of a given incumbency anywhere in the world. And it must transcend that. So there's, if anything is characteristic of India, it is patience. We will wait. Thank you very much.
Thank you Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests. It is a great honor to be here. I want to commend and congratulate Admiral and the ROC Navy, including its partners and the entire team who organizes this wonderful event. Some of you might have noticed I'm the odd one out. I come from a landlocked country. I live in a landlocked country, in Austria. And in having conversations in the last days, I was often told, oh, you have such a beautiful country, such a wonderful country. And yes, I also believe that Austria is a prosperous, rich, safe country. But we are just as dependent on the safeguarding of the seas, freedom of navigation, as any other country on this planet. And it is maybe telling that I am here from Austria that shows how the sea connects us. I have a mission today, and I was asked by the organizers to describe Europe's contributions to maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. And not only do that, but also do that in light of geopolitical rifts and dramatic changes in naval warfare. And all of that in 10 minutes. So, quite a mission, but I am not deterred, and I will do the best I can do with the time that is given. Henry Kissinger said, who do I call if I want to talk to Europe? And that is the challenge that I have today, that I want to describe maritime and naval policies of more than 20 states with maritime and naval forces. So what I can do, I don't have the time to go through each and every country and provide different means and measures and policies, but I can give general trends and a European perspective on current events. What I will do, I will briefly touch upon wealth and prosperity before going to great power competition, or great power collusion, as you call it. I will show you a couple of challenges that European militaries and European navies are facing before moving on to where are we, what are the next moves on this Indo-Pacific chessboard, and conclude with possible steps that both European militaries, navies, states, as well as states here in the region can take. As I said, all European countries are dependent on the sea lines of communication, and because the world is the way it is, we also have critical choke points that are relevant for us, and short, as you know, if the Ever Given is stuck in the Suez Canal, we feel the reverberations globally. Conflict erupting anywhere in these regions will have direct impact on our wealth and our prosperity. Enter great power competition. Historians will be arguing when we actually found ourselves in this new Cold War, referring to the previous speakers. So that's up to the historians, but it is a moment in time where the US government, in its rhetoric at least, is very clear about what it expects of European allies. And quote Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth saying, European allies must, quote, take ownership of conventional security on the continent during a period of war. Which creates major challenges for many European states, because from the outside, they often seem to be very much aligned. You have NATO, you have the EU, there's free trade and all kinds of wonderful things, but they are all separate states. They have separate interests, and they often don't align in many of their interests. And I wanted to show you these. Many of you, at least naval leaders here, will be familiar with the video on the right-hand side, the sinking of a Russian corvette in the Black Sea by an unmanned surface vehicle of the Ukrainians, and it is telling that the Ukrainians without a navy are able to deny the sea space of the Black Sea to a much superior fleet. And on your perspective, the left-hand side, you see ships sunk by the Ukrainians, or at least damaged, such as here in the dry dock by long-range strike missiles, and put out of action. And that creates a problem if you think about it, if you look at the size of European navies. This is a graph I have from a study of mine from 2 years or 3 years back, and it is the total tonnage of European navies. And if you compare these two slides, the previous one to this one, you will see that actually the tonnage of these ships sunk by the Ukrainian Navy within 2 years is more than most European navies have. So what does that do in your force plan? What does that do with your planning to fight a high-intensity war not only the first day, but the second day, the third day, or in the case of Ukraine, more than 1,000 days. European militaries and the general navies in particular, because of their few assets, are challenged because both the necessity to have critical mass, have numbers, is rising, and at the same time, the capability to conduct multi-domain operations as joint forces is also increasing. And this puts increased pressure on especially the smaller European navies, Scandinavian navies for example, but also the larger ones, the medium-sized ones, increasing pressure on them as well. So to the question how to contribute to the free and open seas, how to influence, and that was a discussion we had yesterday evening over strategic influence on the strategic calculus and balance in the Pacific region. A region, if you Google or use ChatGPT and ask how long the coastline is of this region, it says roughly 65,000 kilometers without all the islands. So it's quite a long region, quite a big distance to cover. And we have to ask ourselves, are we already in the Chinese endgame? And much suggests we are, and maybe some things suggest we aren't. And I stole that graph from you, sir. So thank you very much for providing this graph for me, a wonderful paper. So there are, of course, opportunities, and I believe a lot of opportunities, especially talking to colleagues over the last couple of days, also for navies in the region. If you look at the map on the left-hand side, this is how Italy, and especially the Italian Navy, sees its area of influence and area of responsibility. It encompasses, some would say, the Pacific region. So they actually see themselves as having a role to play in this region, per definition, if you will. And of course, we have larger navies like the French and the British Navy, the Royal Navy, that have territories and countries that have territorial interest in this region as well. So what have we seen over the last couple of years? After a massive decline in capabilities among European navies since the end of the Cold War, and I would say the nadir, the lowest point was reached sometime around 2014, right when Russia came marching into Ukraine the first time. We are now seeing a slow uptick, a slow modernization, increase in defense investment, not least since 2022. We see that small navies are investing, medium-sized navies are investing, and also large-sized navies are investing as part of course, joint forces. And we see that the larger European navies are gaining more power projection capabilities than they had 10 or 15 years ago. More interoperability, more cross-decking. All this is increasing, and we have had major deployments of major assets of carrier strike groups, as you are very well familiar with. And this is all fine and dandy, and some say, well, this is only show a flag, and it doesn't really influence strategic calculations in Beijing. But I ask you, who else can send a carrier with F-35s anywhere else in the world except the US and the Europeans? Not that many countries. And many are aspiring to do so, but it is pinnacle, if you will, of naval power. The deployment of nuclear submarines or submarines into the Pacific region is also one aspect. And one thing I want to point to you that I was surprised at, although I covered this, was that the Germans in the Red Sea, in protecting the shipping there, deployed not only a frigate, an air defense frigate, for the first time, but they also resupplied their vessels and their missiles in theater. So those are things that we can do, that European countries can do, to have those procedures and possibilities of actually showing posture, being there, because to the speakers that have said several things this morning, it was stated we need naval power. So you need to have staying power in the area. So I come to the outlook to what I call palm promotion. European navies, European militaries won't be king. There won't be knights. There will be pawns on the Indo-Pacific chessboard. But they can focus on maritime security operations at home and show that maritime security matters, and they can hold their own against aggressive states such as Russia with the Shadow Fleet. Because if a small state like Latvia or Lithuania can deal with a shadow fleet danger by itself, it means something that has this effect globally that can stand up to this gray zone challenges. They should focus on sub-regions if they don't have this global range, and focus maybe not so much on stock protection. We heard a lot about stock protection just before, but with limited means you have to focus on choke point protection. And of course, this room for interoperability. And I will leave you with this final slide. This is a plaque I took a picture of. You actually see my shadow, reflection, as you know, in the War Memorial in Seoul. And it says, a bridge between Korean and international community collaborating to prevent war and promote peace and unity. I believe there's a lot of room for cooperation between European militaries and navies. They have limited means, but we see, especially large navies, increasing their operational tempo and their posture in this region. We see that bi-mini multilateral cooperation matter, be it things like AUKUS, be it defense industrial cooperation, such as Korean ships being built here and then used by the Royal Navy and the Norwegian Navy, or be it exercises. Finally, Europeans are rebuilding, some are building and some are rebuilding their maritime forces. And partnerships take time. But I believe if we can sustain this current trend in investment throughout Europe, despite all the challenges, European maritime forces will be in a better position in the upcoming years. And therefore, it's upon you also in the region to reach out, to think of this plaque, to build those bridges, to foster cooperation, to provide maritime security here and globally. And with that, I'd like to close. Thank you very much.
We all had a chance to listen to each presenter's excellent presentation. Since we don't have a designated discussant, I'll ask a question to each presenter. And presenters, please make your answer short. First, Professor Kim. In terms of maritime security, what area or direction South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy should focus on?
네, 한국의 인태지역 전략은 자유롭고 열려있는 인도태평양의 조화로운 질서, 공존과 번영을 위한 글로벌 역할을 해야 된다. 방점을 두고 싶습니다. 특정 국가를 우리가 반대하거나 특정 국가와 전쟁을 대비하기 위한 것은 당연히 아니죠. 우리가 1945년에 2차 세계대전을 마치고 미국 중심의 자유주의 국제 질서를 설계적 시스템 조약이라든가 유엔 월드뱅크 IMF 시스템을 만들면서 사실은 강대국이 약소국을 마음대로 점령하거나 흔들리지 않는 세계 최초의 실험에 성공한 겁니다. 우리가 지금 당연하게 여기고 있는 이 질서가 인류 4,000년 역사에 있어서 100년이 채 안 됐다는 거죠. 우리가 지금 믿고 지내는데 태어나서 눈 떠보니 강대국이 약속을 침략하지 않는 세상에 우리가 태어난 것 뿐이에요. 사실 1945년 이전에 강대국이 약속을 마음대로 짓밟고 그걸 위해서 살아남기 위한 약소국의 사대와 어떤 동맹들이 있었고 그게 삼국지 같은 소설들이 계속 나옵니다. 우리가 이 질서가 4,000년이 됐다고 착각을 하시면 안 되고 이 질서는 이제 100년이 채 안 됩니다. 그럼 이 질서가 지금 위협을 받고 있는 시대가 다시 왔다. 라고 하는 건 러시아와 중국이 각 지역에 자기 패권을 유지해 달라는 겁니다. 특히 중국은 미국이 세운 질서의 가장 큰 수혜국이면서 이 지역 질서 안에서 본인의 지역 헤게모니를 인정하라. 그 안에 있는 남중국해라든가 필리핀이라든가 이제 북한을 이용한 중국의 확대가 있는 것이고요. 우리는 지금 이 질서가 무너지면 다시 한번 지난 2000년 중국에 사대해야 되는 그 질서로 돌아갈 수가 있습니다. 지금 우리가 북핵 위협 때문에 다른 것들을 생각하지 못했는데 우리는 이 자유주의 세계 질서의 어떻게 보면 가장 큰 수혜자 넘버원입니다. 전 세계가 2차 세계대전 이전하고 이후로 나눴을 때 그 전에 계속해서 가난했던 나라들은 지금도 가난하고 있습니다. 99%는 그대로 가고 있고요. 동아시아의 4마리 요리라고 하는 한국, 대만, 일본, 이런 홍콩 몇 개 싱가포르 나라들만 지금 그 나라, 그 전부 다 유일하게 부유해지고 민주화된 겁니다. 지금 우리가 그 이전의 세계 질서로 돌아갈 수 있다는 것이 바로 이 중국의 부상과 자유롭고 열려있는 인도太平洋지역의 위협입니다. 우리가 좋은 예를 들면 미사일 가이드라인 우리가 미국하고 생각보다 일찍 우리가 해제를 받아냈잖아요. 그때 우리 정부가 했던 노력의 로직이 뭐였죠? 사드를 봐라. 미국 미사일 우리 쪽에 들어오면 중국이 저러고 난리를 치니까 우리가 우리 미사일을 개발할 수 있도록 가이드라인을 해체시키자. 바로 협상에 성공을 했습니다. 다만 조건은 미사일을 마음대로 욕하지 않는다는 미국 상무부의 요구 조건을 우리가 이런 식으로 이제 자주 해양력을 세계 질서 무대에 뻗쳐나가야 된다는 거죠. 네마로 관련해서 제가 얘기 많이 하고요. 미국보다 중국의 건조 능력이 엄청나게 수십 배 앞서나가 있다는 것들 미국 사회에 충격을 만들었고 안보 전문가들이 이미 몇십 년부터 계속 경고하면서 네이버 관리지에 메리타임 디파트먼트에 수많은 교수들도 채용을 했고 우리 프레스 같은 박사님들이 맨 하려고 지금 하시게 된 것도 미국이 느끼고 있는 자유질서의 위기입니다. 한국에 요청을 했잖아요. 우리한테는 엄청난 어떤 어드밴티지가 있고 미국과 함께 이 세계 질서를 수호할 수 있는 가장 중요한 리딩 국가로 인정을 받은 겁니다. 그전에는 수혜를 받는 국가였어요. 지금은 미국과 이런 세계의 자유 질서를 보호하는 열려있고 자유로운 인도太平洋질서를 보호하는 리딩 국가로 뻗쳐나갈 수 있는 목전에 와 있습니다. 이건 우리가 국회 위협을 포기하자는 건 아니고 국회 위협은 위협대로 관리하되 한국해군 인도太平洋지역에서 이러한 역할을 해군과 산업을 기반으로 뻗쳐나가야 된다는 겁니다. 지금 우리한테 엄청난 기회의 문이 열렸고요. 세계 질서를 끌고 나갈 수 있는 조로의 찬스가 지금 열렸습니다. 그 안에 해군과 국제사회 해양 협력이 있고요. 미국의 가장 강력한 친구가 가장 강력한 요청을 하고 있는 지금 이 시기 우리는 유엔협력을 통해서 미국과 함께 자유한국의 번영을 이루는듯이 지금 우리가 가장 수혜받았던 세계에서 최초의 실험이에요. 자유질서를 지키기 위한 리딩 역할을 해야 됩니다. 우리나라 국가한테는 천년의 기회가 열렸다고 보고요. 그 안에 인도太平洋안에서의 위기가 미국과 함께 그리고 주요 라이크 마인드를 뭉치는 함께 인도太平洋전략이 뻗쳐나가야 됩니다. 그 안에 이제 인도太平洋전략이 있고요. 한미 안보 협력이 있고요. 우리가 세계 무대로 뻗쳐나가고 있는 최고의 친구 미국과 일본과 함께 이 질서를 지킬 수 있는 기회가 있다고 보고요. 그 안에 저희의 역할이 있다고 합니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Senator, you said changing structural environment requires new type of neighbor-state threat, which combines economy, diplomacy, and military. How does it play out in terms of the U.S. relationships with allies in East Asia? I mean, what kind of allies framework do you have in mind? What kind of cooperation do you expect from the allies?
Thank you. Well, I think it's probably first to look at how the current administration is executing in this kind of framework. Because I don't think it's one that's been deliberated and consciously decided, but the reality is success, geopolitical success. In other words, the advancement of your national interests. In this case, my province is the United States, but it's no different with what South Korea's leaders do with their people. That's Korea first. It's no different than America. So right now, I think it's playing out in course. And the fallacy in many, at the Heritage Foundation, we get lots of foreign countries that come by asking questions, what's the future of the policies, how do we actually mitigate tariffs? And everyone has always viewed tariffs as an economic tool for economic ends. And that's the fallacy. This administration doesn't only pursue or use its economic tools for economic ends, it also pursues it for policy, for diplomatic ends, as well as military. For some European countries, the tariff is about reciprocity, treating our products the same as we treat your products. But in other cases, it's also leverage to say you need to spend more on defense. So I give you one example, and it's tariffs, but there's so many others. And even in the last administration, the Biden administration, the same thing. Similar, different types of tools and levers, but the same. And if you go all the way back to the Obama administration, there's some of this. But again, the danger, the threat really drives people, nations, to take actions. What makes good sense, that's not enough. And so we really are in a crisis situation where there already are plans out there. Many of us academics have written for years, frameworks and structures, and all kinds of esoteric discussions. So that's the plan, but it's not enough. We also have leaders